I'd like to begin by just saying thanks to everybody who participated in our first live discussion, and to those of you that are perhaps observing from the sidelines, reading the novel along with us. Today, I'd like to talk about Midnight's Children as seen through the genre of maximalism. It's a subject that has interested me for some time, and I think it's very applicable to the novel we're currently reading. In thinking about Midnight's Children in the years since I first read it, and listening to it again this year, and by the way, if you get a chance, the audio version is, in my opinion, completely fantastic. I've assembled some thoughts about how this novel fits in the contemporary body of literature. Big novels or big ideas have always appealed to me, and I've searched through critical writings to develop or try to develop a coherent explanation for those who ask, Steve, why do you like those big novels? Saying I like it because it satisfies all of my aesthetic and intellectual pleasure centers just doesn't really cut it. And about 2 years ago, I found a book by Stefano Ercolino, a former Stanford Fulbright scholar and postdoctoral fellow in comparative literature in Berlin. The book, entitled The Maximalist Novel, From Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow to Roberto Bolaño's 2666, describes what Ercolino calls a new genre of fiction, born from previous attempts by other critics to define the seemingly chaotic excess of the doorstop novels or cinderblock novels I so much love. Ercolino ties his work to historical criticism from the Greek epics to the most recent postmodern efforts. But what he really does is invest 164 pages in describing craft in very specific terms, divided into 10 elements that create genre, or specifically the maximalist novel. Midnight's Children, in my opinion, or at least my argument will be, belongs to that genre. And I think there's 3 keys to understanding that. As you'll see on the slide here, how did we get to maximalism? What did the genre come out of? What are the 10 craft elements to be found in maximalist novels? And finally, how do those craft elements apply to Midnight's Children as a maximalist novel? Ercolino postulates that maximalism grew out of systems theory, or the systems theory of literature, a subset of the systems theory of the social sciences, advanced by Thomas Leclair in his 1999 work, The Art of Excess, and his essays, standalone essays, on Richard Powers, David Foster Wallace, and William Vollmann. A systems theory tells us that these novelists and others like them, and there are many, arose out of a paradigm shift in the natural sciences, especially biology, a shift away from mechanist physics that was prevalent in nearly all areas of scientific inquiry up to the 1920s, to a physics based on interconnectedness, organization, information exchange, and openness, a system that eventually permeated literature and the arts. And this resonates with me, as anyone who I've shared more than a passing conversation with will quickly realize. The point of systems theory in the arts is to provide a creator, a writer, or an engaged reader in our case, with the intellectual means to understand and challenge prevailing power structures in order to inspire the effort to bring about change or something better, or to something better. Systems theory is based on encyclopedic knowledge, the accumulation of all-encompassing data sets, a rhetorical narrative strategy, and redirection of the reader's mindset from the personal and individual to the common and global. It's the purest form of idealism, and one that might be characterized as naive or overly simplistic to many. But I think the relationship between the old physics of individual blots of matter behaving in particular ways to a collective mindset is just logically apparent. Maximalist theory, which traces systems theory as evolving into the experimental, incomplete, open chaos of the mega novels of post-World War II, began with William Gaddis's The Recognitions, which, in a circular paradox, can be viewed as the progeny of epics such as Faust, Moby Dick, The Ring of the Nibelung, Ulysses, Dante's Divine Comedy, The Wasteland, and The Man Without Qualities, to name a few. I've given you a list of some of these postmodern novels that emerged out of these older epic forms. The 10 craft elements of maximalism exist to create the chaos, then contain it, and then transcend the fiction as entertainment model to create greater meaning for the reader. So let's begin with the list. The 10 elements are length, encyclopedic mode, dissonant chorality, and don't worry, I'll explain these as we go forward, diegetic exuberance, completeness, narrational omniscience, paranoid imagination, intersemiosity, ethical commitment, and hybrid realism. Now, the first four in the column labeled chaos and disorder, length, encyclopedic mode, dissonant chorality, and diegetic exuberance, are the elements that create the impression of chaos, disorder, and quite often confusion in the mind of the reader as they begin one of these large novels, especially a reader looking for a conventional narrative, or, as Aristotle would say, a unity of plot, character, theme, time, and place. Number 5 through 7, under the heading Order and Containment, Completeness, Narrational Omniscience, and Paranoid Imagination, are the tools the author uses to bring the chaos into a contained package, giving it a sense of order and comprehension. And numbers 8 through 10, From Story to Literature, Intersemiosity, Ethical Commitment, and Hybrid Realism, are the tools that form a foundation upon which the text itself is built, and they serve as benchmarks for the value of the text as both story, entertainment, and literature, edification. So let's go a bit deeper into each of these 10 elements and the 10 craft points that go along with them. Beginning with length. Maximalist genre is a new genre that proposes to empower one to take on the world out of necessity. And a new genre like that needs length in order to experiment, to innovate, and to exist free of the rigid structures of plot of characterization of the past, even if the narrative becomes completely fragmented. The idea here is that some of these experiments, these fragments, will prove viable, and over time they cohere into some new form that centralizes as empowerment. 400 pages minimally seems to be the tipping point for space and accumulation of enough data, of enough innovation. So at 552 pages, Midnight's Children meets this criteria. In encyclopedic mode, here we're looking at the novel as a synthetic representation of the totality of life, the multiplication and differentiation of an epic narrative within the context of a single text is used to master the totality of chaos and bring some semblance of narrative order to it. It requires a willingness on the part of the writer to accumulate vast stores of data from many sources and construct a work of heterogeneous texts into one. In this case, the subject matter is the history of India at the end of and immediately following the British colonial occupation. Third is dissonant chorality. So this technique involves the chorality with polyphony, or having a discernible voice of a central narrator presenting many independent and self-contained stories. These are unfolded as fragments, with separations indicated by typology, primarily white space, but also alterations in formatting, ellipses, change of POV character, and time shifts that appear immediately after breaks in the text. The use of many voices, which is the definition of polyphony, organized in diegetic form, which is another word for narrative, allows for diversity of genre, style, and fields of knowledge in order to develop depth, complexity, and richness. With Salim Sinai, we find an omniscient third-person narrator, a close third-person narrator, first-person narrative point of view at various points in the novel, and these are presented as reportage, as in newspaper style, cinematic style, dramatic style, internal and external voices of the characters as expressed through the dissonant chorality of Salim Sinai. Diegetic exuberance. This is simply the excessive, dense, hypertrophic narration, the layers of story, character, and theme that proliferate to include the whole world within the space of the novel. The unity of the opening explodes into many fragmented stories, each containing enough material for their own novel, and creating a text in which it is difficult and perhaps impossible to point with certainty to any single thread as the principal narrative. Each character fragment has an accompanying and paired plot fragment, and these will tie to thematic concerns as the novel continues. We can look at the parallel lives of Salim and Shiva, the parallel histories of India and Pakistan, the macro-micro pairing of events in the history of these nations with Salim, his family, and the other children of Midnight, and the way they create an onion that reveals more layers dispersed over a progressively wider period of time and geography as the novel progresses. Understand, this is not overwriting by repeating the same points over and over again, but it's taking all these different narratives, all these different stories, and linking them to characters, to plot, and to theme in progressive ways that eventually contain the entire world of the novel. Elements 5 through 7, where we contain the chaos created by 1 through 4 into an order and comprehensible form. Completeness. This is really important in my opinion. If you're going to include everything, then you have to create a cosmos, not chaos. If the Big Bang never organized into galaxies, stars, and planets, but just remained an expanding ball of disorganized gas and immaterial energy, there would be no point to the universe. Some might argue there isn't one anyhow, but at least there is consciousness that temporally creates order. 3 structural techniques are used to create a unity of wholeness. Circular geometry, such as one finds in novels that open with their endings and then regress to travel back to that point and sometimes beyond as a denouement. Temporal architecture, where events are bound to time so that a chronological order can be assembled, if not inherently presented in the narrative. And conceptual ideation, consisting of leitmotif that recurs throughout the text. Mythology and intertextual forms or illusions. Rushdie uses all of these techniques to build his metaphors and similes and to bring order out of the chaos and confusion of the novel. Narrational omniscience. This is a narrator who either knows more than the characters, knows as much as the characters, or knows less than the characters. Salim is clearly of the first type, though an argument can be made that much of his special knowledge is born out of his belief that he is inextricably tied to historical events in India during the 20th century. To have omniscience, there has to be at least one part of the narrative, or the combined whole of all the narrators, that in and of itself knows more than the characters within the novel. Paranoid imagination. So paranoia, conspiracy theories, false narratives around mortal threats are really the currency of our cultural chaos today. They form the engine of imagination that drives the plots of life, and in many ways, the plot of this novel. Paranoia drives the engine of postmodern imagination, character formation, and postmodern answers to impossible questions amid the chaos of a world whose information and technology has leaped past any one individual's ability to comprehend, organize, and hold it simultaneously. Conspiracies form the basis of explaining powerlessness in the semiotic system of power, where signs and symbols replace reality and sensory experience. Unshakable conviction by the paranoid about conspiracy drives much action in life and the Maximalist novel. Now we can begin with Salim's belief that he is literally cracking into pieces and follow the dissolution of his relationship to reality. Just how unreliable he is as a narrator depends to some extent on the background and belief of the reader. In India, magical events are acceptable as explanations for matters science will not or has not yet provided alternative explanations for. And in the West, readers may see all non-evidentiary logic as relating to delusion, paranoia, or other psychological dysfunction. Finally, we come to elements 8 through 10. From story to literature, adding value to the entertainment. Intersemiosity. This is simply the use of imagery in text form, the use of cinematic and visual artistry, such as painting, to shape the look of fragments, point the camera lens of narrative, and allow the admission of art beyond simple text, and reinforce the idea that everything is everything, that no art is purely visual or purely textual, but always a mixture. One need only catalog the cinematic references in this novel to understand that Rushdie is fully embracing this concept. The narrative in itself is often strongly visual, regardless of the absence or presence of direct cinematic illusion. It evokes our senses, and it particularly evokes our sense of sight and smell. Smell itself connects to sights and colors within the novel. The ethical commitment. Without this, the novel is too much for entertainment and too little for instruction. Here is where all the postmodern themes seen in the novel are presented. Here is where the moral code is expressed or illuminated for the reader. As a partial list, and I'm sure we can find more, includes clashes of culture, clashes of religious ideologies, class differences, gender issues, the role of capitalism, technology, terrorism in the modern world, depression, psychological dysfunction, poverty, suicide, broken families, sexuality, crime, genocide, cults of personality. It's a long list. Every story has its own themes as Salim relates his narrative to us. Hybrid realism, the final of the 10 elements. Postmodern theory makes a trope of hyperrealism. Maximalism recognizes that underlying every sort of alternate reality, there needs to be a classical or formal logic. Reality can be expressed as thematic, semiotic, cognitive, the logic of an individual, of a group, hysterical logic, artificial logic, and imagined reality. It's all in the various narratives of this novel. You can start with the legendary age and stories of Ty the Boatman. The prophecies around Salim's birth also play a significant role. The anthropomorphosis of a financial freeze, literally freezing the body of Ahmed Sinai. 1,001 children born with special powers. Noses that are able to detect much more than the sense beneath them. Telepathic and telekinetic powers. Keep looking, and Rushdie's fertile imagination generates alternate realities with their own internal logic in nearly every chapter. Well, I think that's more than enough to get what I wanted to say about the novel into some form where any interested among you can find the maximalist genre tropes within the novel. I appreciate your attention for however long it lasted. I look forward to our next discussion of Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie. And I'd like to close with 2 final questions to think about and possibly discuss later. The first is, can a reader truly have dazzling epiphanies reading a novel that is torrential, chaotic, labyrinthine, long-winded, shrouded in obscure symbolism, and structured by rigid and often hard to unravel logic? And second, in thinking about myth, epic, and novel forms that cycle throughout history, is one better suited than another to particular historical moments? If so, what must shift to transition and evolve these forms? Thanks again for your attention. We'll see you at our next live discussion.